Bezos, Musk, Rockefeller, Carnegie. When you think of the richest people in history, those are the names that come up. They're wrong. The wealthiest person who has ever lived was an African king who died 700 years ago, and almost no one in the West has heard his name. In the year 1324, this man set out from West Africa to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. He brought with him 60,000 people, 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of pure gold, 500 personal servants, each carrying a gold staff. When he reached the city of Cairo, then the largest gold market in the known world, he gave so much of it away that the price of gold collapsed. By some accounts, gold lost up to a quarter of its value overnight. It would take Cairo's economy 12 years to recover. His name was Mansa Musa. He ruled the Empire of Mali, a kingdom that, at the time, controlled roughly half the gold supply of the known world.
This is the story of how he rose to power, why his pilgrimage shook 3 continents, and what he built when he came home, including a city whose libraries Europe would not match for 300 years. I'm Brother Idris, and welcome to the archive, where forgotten history lives again. To understand Mansa Musa, you have to understand the empire he inherited. The Mali Empire was founded around 1235 by a warrior king named Sundiata Keita, a figure so legendary that his story is still sung today by traditional storytellers called griots. 800 years after his death, his name still echoes through West African villages. By the early 1300s, Mali stretched across what is now Senegal, Mauritania, the Gambia, Guinea, and modern-day Mali itself. It was an area larger than all of Western Europe at the time. Its population is hard to estimate, but Italian art historian Sergio Domian has noted that at its height, Mali contained at least 400 cities, with the interior of the Niger Delta densely populated. Mansa Musa came to power around the year 1312. The circumstances were unusual. According to Mansa Musa's own account, preserved by the Arab historian Shihab al-Umari, his predecessor was obsessed with one question: what lay across the Atlantic Ocean? The previous Mansa first sent out 200 ships to find the western edge of the sea. Only one returned. Its captain reported that the others had vanished into a great whirlpool. Unsatisfied, the Mansa decided to lead a second expedition himself. This time, he took 2,000 ships and appointed Musa as his deputy to govern the empire while he was away. He never came back, and some modern historians think Mansa Musa may have made up that story, a convenient explanation for how he came to power. We don't know. What we do know is this: by 1312, Musa was the ruler of the largest, wealthiest empire in West Africa. And in 1324, he made the decision that would change everything. Like all observant Muslims who could afford it, Mansa Musa was obligated to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in his life. But Mansa Musa did not travel like an ordinary pilgrim. Mali's wealth came from 2 things: gold and salt. The gold was mined in the south, in regions called Bambouk and Bouré, alluvial deposits along the rivers where workers panned and dug shallow shafts. By the 14th century, scholars estimate that Mali was the source of nearly half the gold exported from the Old World. The salt came from the north, from a brutal mining outpost called Tagaza, in the middle of the Sahara, where the buildings were literally constructed from blocks of salt because nothing else was available. Mansa Musa's empire sat at the crossroads of these 2 trades. Caravans of thousands of camels crossed his territory each year, paying taxes on every load. But here's what makes Mali's economy fascinating. The gold itself didn't always belong directly to the empire. The mines were worked by traditional communities,
many with their own animist religions, who weren't fully under Mali's control. The Mansas figured out something smart. They didn't try to occupy the goldfields. Instead, they extracted tribute and taxed every transaction. They took a cut of everything. And they had a strict policy. The entire empire used gold dust as currency, but raw gold nuggets were the personal property of the Mansa. Anyone who found one had to surrender it to the imperial treasury. Over generations, this built up a reserve so large that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe it. Modern historians have tried to estimate Mansa Musa's personal fortune in today's terms. The most cited number is around $400 billion. But almost everyone who studies him agrees this is meaningless. His wealth wasn't measured in cash or assets the way we measure it. He didn't own stocks or banks. He owned the land, the mines, and the labor of an empire larger than France, England, Spain, and Germany combined. His wealth was, as one Time magazine analysis put it, effectively incalculable. Of all the goods passing through Mali, 3 were most prized. Salt was carried south on the backs of camels, flat slabs as heavy as a man, each worth a small fortune at its destination. In hot climates, salt was essential to preserve food and to replace what the body lost on long journeys. Without it, you couldn't survive long-distance trade in the desert. Gold flowed in the opposite direction, north across the Sahara to the Mediterranean world, where Italian and Egyptian merchants paid for it with silks, books, weapons, and craftsmen. The third commodity was the kola nut, a stimulant that helped travelers endure the desert. We don't think much about kola nuts today, but in the 14th century, they were a luxury good in markets from Cairo to Constantinople. All of this passed through Mali, and every transaction paid a tax to Mansa Musa. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out from his capital city of Niani. Mecca was 4,000 miles away. The journey would take more than a year. What followed was, by every contemporary account, the most extraordinary procession the medieval world had ever seen. The numbers come down to us through Arab chroniclers, primarily Shihab al-Umari, who arrived in Cairo about a decade after Mansa Musa's visit and interviewed officials who had been there. 60,000 men in the procession, each one part of a slow river of people moving across the desert. 100 camels, each carrying around 300 pounds of gold dust. 500 personal servants, each holding a staff of solid gold weighing about 6 pounds. 12,000 attendants dressed in Persian silk, marching in formation behind the king. The Smithsonian's Gus Casely Hayford has described eyewitness accounts of the caravan. It was like a whole town breaking camp every night in the desert. They carried everything they needed, including a portable mosque that they would assemble each Friday so the Mansa could pray. In July of 1324, after months of travel, Mansa Musa's caravan arrived at the outskirts of Cairo. Cairo at this time was probably the largest city in the world outside of China, about 1 million people. It was the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria. The Sultan was al-Malik al-Nasir Muhammad, one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world. The Malian caravan camped for 3 days near the pyramids of Giza. Then, on July 19th, Mansa Musa crossed the Nile and entered the city. What happened next is one of the most told stories in medieval Islamic diplomacy. By protocol, any visiting ruler entering the Mamluk court was required to prostrate himself and kiss the ground before the Sultan. It was the standard gesture of submission. Mansa Musa refused. When officials demanded he kneel, his response, preserved by al-Umari, became one of the most quoted lines about him. One of his advisors leaned over and whispered something. Then Mansa Musa turned to the Egyptians and said, "I make obeisance to God who created me." Then he prostrated, but framed it as a prayer to God himself, not to the Sultan. The Sultan, to his credit, half rose from his throne, embraced Mansa Musa as an equal, and seated him beside himself. They talked for a long time. Al-Umari recorded that Mansa Musa then sent 50,000 gold dinars to the Sultan as a first meeting gift, before they had even discussed business. Mansa Musa stayed in Cairo for 3 months. The Sultan lent him a palace.
What followed has gone down in history as the most expensive shopping trip ever recorded. Mansa Musa gave gold to the poor in the streets. He gave gold to officials. He gave gold to mosques and madrasas. According to one account, he commissioned a new mosque to be built in Cairo every Friday so he could pray in a different one each week. The Egyptian merchants saw their opportunity and immediately raised prices to 5 times the normal rate. The Malians paid without question. By the time Mansa Musa left for Mecca on October 18th, the price of gold in Cairo had collapsed. The 14th century chronicler al-Makrizi, writing decades later, recorded the damage. The gold dinar lost about 6 dirhams in value almost immediately after his visit. Other sources put the depreciation at 20 to 25%. It would take 12 years for the price to recover. But here's a detail you almost never hear about Mansa Musa's pilgrimage. By the time he came back through Cairo on his way home, he had run out of money. The richest man on earth was broke. He had to borrow from Egyptian moneylenders at extortionate interest rates just to fund the rest of his journey home. But Mansa Musa did not return empty-handed from his journey. Among the people he had met on his pilgrimage was a poet and architect from Granada, in Muslim Spain, named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Al-Sahili was a polymath, a jurist, a poet, and a designer. Mansa Musa convinced him to come back to Mali. By some accounts, recorded by Ibn Khaldun, al-Sahili was paid 12,000 mithqals of gold dust for his work. That's around 50 kilograms of pure gold, just for one architect. Back in Mali, Mansa Musa launched what we would now call a cultural revolution. He commissioned the Jingu Ereber Mosque in the city of Timbuktu. Built in 1327, it still stands today, almost 700 years later, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But the mosque was just the beginning. The real legacy was scholarly. Mansa Musa expanded an existing institution called the Sankore Mosque into a major center of Islamic learning. Under him and his successors, Timbuktu became one of the most important academic cities in the medieval world. By the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars studied there subjects ranging from astronomy and mathematics to law, medicine, and history. Modern historians are careful. There was no centralized university the way Oxford or Bologna existed. Instead, individual scholars taught their own students at home or in mosques, building up vast private libraries. Some of these scholars amassed personal libraries of more than 1,600 manuscripts. The total number of manuscripts produced and collected in Timbuktu over the centuries has been estimated at up to 700,000. Mansa Musa died around 1337. By that time, his fame had reached Europe. In 1375, almost 40 years after his death, a Jewish cartographer on the Spanish island of Majorca produced what's now called the Catalan Atlas. It was one of the most detailed maps of the medieval world ever made. On it, where Mali should be, the cartographer drew a black king sitting on a throne, holding a gold nugget the size of his fist. The caption read in Catalan, "This is the richest and most noble king in all the land, by reason of the great quantity of gold which is gathered in his country." This is the first known European depiction of a sub-Saharan African ruler. It would influence European imagination of West Africa for the next 2 centuries. Some historians argue that the dream of finding the source of all that gold is what motivated the Portuguese to begin sailing down the African coast in the 1400s. Which means, in a strange way, the European age of exploration began with a Malian king's pilgrimage.
Mansa Musa's empire didn't last.
By the late 1400s, internal divisions and outside pressure had broken Mali apart, and the Songhai Empire rose to take its place. The mosque he built still stands. Many of the manuscripts produced in Timbuktu have survived, some hidden in family vaults during the Tuareg conflicts of 2012, then digitized in international rescue projects. But the man himself, the wealthiest individual who ever lived, whose journey reshaped trade across 3 continents, sits on the edge of Western historical memory. Most people who can name 3 Roman emperors couldn't name a single Malian one. Why? That's a question we'll come back to in future videos. If you found this story interesting, the next video in the series is about a kingdom even less remembered and even larger that came after Mali, the Songhai Empire. We'll cover its rise, its libraries, and the day it disappeared in a single battle. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The sources for everything you heard today are linked below. I'm Brother Idris, and the archive remains open.